Welcome, everyone. This is Jim Bergman with Commercial Officers Group, and thank you so much for joining in on today's session. Based on the enrollments for today's session, this must be a topic that is high on people's agendas. We, of course, are going to be covering innovation in a value for money world. We're looking at this largely for purposes of today's session from a public sector perspective within Australia. But as we record our sessions and we make them available to a broader audience, if you're listening to this on a recorded basis, you might not be in the public sector or you might not be in Australia. But that, just wanted to make sure you understood why we're putting a little bit more emphasis and focus to those two dimensions of public sector and Australia. But by all means, if you're listening on a recorded basis, if you have any questions, certainly follow up with us. So let's get ourselves started here. Today, we're going to cover innovation. We're going to talk about how important it is to engage our suppliers through supplier relationship management, or SRM, into a different platform, a different discussion, that discussion being around innovation. The ultimate reason why we want to get into innovation with our suppliers is because we're pursuing value for money. Traditional sourcing and contracting practitioners and the practices that they've developed and deployed over the past 20 years or so have really generated significant value for money for their organizations. However, we've seen, unfortunately, that there is somewhat of a tapering off of that return of the investment of being put into that capture of value for money. Yes, there's still plenty of value to money to be captured under the traditional ways, but we're finding that those traditional ways are somewhat running their due course. And so we need to find, if we're going to go for higher levels of success, new and different approaches to pursue that value for money. And the way in which we within Commercial Officers Group and doing our research interactions with our clients, with our licensees, those that we're doing business with, are clearly sounding the bell that they are taking a new approach. We within Commercial Officers Group have been seeing this happening for at least the past 15 to 20 years. In most instances over the past 15, 20 years, it's been a few isolated instances. Particular organizations seem to have developed some mastery, but those who have mastered this are in a very small minority. And that small minority has been able to demonstrate competitive advantage, being able to create competitive differentiators. And within the public sector, since it is not really a competitive environment, we nevertheless need to justify to our citizenry, to our taxpayers, to our constituents, that we are demonstrating value for money beyond what we would otherwise have captured if we were just sitting idle and doing our jobs. And so we're at a different level of pursuit that we have embarked upon. And so as we move forward as those practitioners in the sourcing and contracting mode, we have to find ways to foster that innovation. Unfortunately, too often, we disable innovation from arising. And not only innovation, but a more fundamental foundation around collaboration, and yet even further of a fundamental foundation around trust. And so as we venture forward looking for new ways to build innovation, we've got to ask ourselves, are we building this into our overall system, into our process, into our capabilities and competencies? We within Commercial Officers Group share this slide on a number of our sessions, and today is no different. We see the overall contracting, the tendering, the sourcing practices is following somewhat of a process that is cyclical. At the very beginning of the process, starting at the 12 o'clock position, using the analogy to a clock or wristwatch, at the 12 o'clock position, we are just starting out. And we initially focus on strategy. As we move forward through that process, we then get into the tendering phase. Eventually, we will negotiate, and ultimately at 9 o'clock, we typically are signing a contract with a particular supplier. And from that 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock position, we're in that fulfillment and delivery mode. And so over these 4 quadrants, if you were to break the process into 4 equal quadrants, we basically are developing strategy, going out to tender, negotiating, and the delivering. That equates basically to thinking about what we're going to do, writing it down, agreeing upon it, and then going and doing it. Obviously, as we move through this process, we have some successes and perhaps some shortcomings. Regardless if we're succeeding or falling short, we still need to capture some lessons learned and be able to share those lessons so that we can share with our colleagues and peers how we've pursued certain endeavors with great success and what things haven't worked so well. And so as we get into innovation and driving greater value for money, many of us are going to be exploring new territory, new grounds, new plateaus that we're going to be visiting in this pursuit. And as we get into that journey, yes, we for ourselves personally need to find ways of succeeding, but we also need to be able to go to the next level of sharing and somewhat training and teaching our organization how to do this and to do it well. And so I would encourage you that as you continue around the cycle in your sourcing and contracting process, to be sure to take time to record the successes that you're having and the not so successful moments and be able to share those internally. We would encourage you that at the end of this journey that you'll be on in terms of getting greater value for money through innovation, we want to make sure that you engage your suppliers in the ways that they are requesting, the ways in which we expect and they expect us to behave moving forward. And so sometimes this creates a new set of rules, a new playbook for ourselves. And we would want to ask ourselves, what can we do different versus what we're doing now in order to attain that higher level? Now, one caveat I do want to give you is that not every supplier, not every relationship, not every category or commodity of expenditure is going to be an ideal candidate for innovation. We might be basically without much hope of getting to higher levels of value for money in certain instances. And so prior to going on to that journey towards greater value for money through innovation, I would encourage you to step back a moment and ask yourself, using the crawl check analysis, which is somewhat ubiquitous across the globe, across the profession. But if you're not going to use the crawl check analysis, use some other type of tool to determine whether or not this contract, this project, this supplier relationship is one in which we would want to invest additional resource to pursue that innovation. We see within Commercial Officers Group that those areas of greatest success are the ones in which we have these strategic commodities, strategic categories of expenditure. Yes, we can create greater value for money in the bottleneck and the leverage areas, but unfortunately, we've seen in the non-critical, pure basic transactional area of the analysis that we tend not to get greater value for money. So as we proceed over the next few minutes talking about value for money, innovation, collaboration, building trust with us and our suppliers, that we're really focusing on the upper right quadrant, or at least if we were to draw a diagonal from the northwest to the southeast corner of the diagram, that northeast half of this diagram. Not every supplier is going to be the ideal candidate. And I certainly don't want to send you out onto a mission to try to create greater value for money with an opportunity that might not be the best fit for that. I assure you, you have got plenty of opportunities in front of you if you just focus on this quadrant or on that upper right half of this diagram. So with that caveat said and that preface and introduction all behind us, let's focus on some of the topics we're going to cover in greater detail today. First, we're going to look at how to build the additional needed levels, that foundation of trust, not only internally, but externally. And I would suggest to you that without that first fundamental level of trust, your pursuit for innovation with your suppliers is going to be somewhat less than ideal. And so building trust first becomes job one before we go on to the next level collaboration and innovation. I would also encourage you to find ways to harness that trust to a higher level and being able to get to collaboration in order to get to that ultimate innovative level. We want to make sure that as we push collaboration to the higher level, to that level of innovation, the greater level of value for money, that we identify techniques, the practices, the policies, the governance that is needed for us to have repeated success. We don't want our successes to just be one time only by chance or perhaps by luck. We want to make sure that this is a deliberate pursuit that has governance around it, it has structure, it creates a process, following somewhat of the scientific methodology around repeatable successes, as if we were in a scientific laboratory conducting an experiment and being able to use a scientific method to be able to identify the variables that come into play and those variables that don't have an impact. And so creating much more of a discipline around creating collaboration. Now, granted, collaboration is going to be inspired by creativity and by intuitive thought at times, but that's not to dismiss it as being something that we cannot build some structure and some repeatability around it. We want to make sure that as we pursue the greater value for money through innovation, that we understand that there's going to be some new additional capabilities and competencies, or we're going to be shifting our focus on a greater effort around the capabilities, greater emphasis around the competencies. And then we, of course, want to make sure that we understand some of the elements around measuring and reporting the successes that we hopefully will be getting around innovation and ensuring that those successes are understood, that they are communicated, and hopefully they inspire our peers and colleagues to follow a similar path. So with that said, those 5 topics we'll be covering. First off, let's take a preface before I get into the first one and ask a key question, and that is, we're going to be mentioning value for money for a few minutes here. But first off, what is that concept of value for money? To some, we define value for money as getting whatever value you're paying for. So if we're paying $100, we're getting $100 of value. Others deem value for money as being, while not explicitly stated in the label of value for money, nevertheless capturing greater value than what you pay for. And so there is somewhat of a subtle difference, but still, we're paying something, say $100, we expect either $100 in return or more than $100 in return, that return being the value. And we would submit to you that in many instances, capturing more value than what you pay for is simply unreasonable. It sets expectations far too high. Value can be defined in certain ways under the first bullet point here as basically what you are paying for. You can set expectations that you're going to look for $120 of value and only pay for $100 worth. That value is a 1.2 multiplier of what your investment is. And so sometimes we just have to create realistic expectations around value as we define what value for money is. And so core to this discussion is going to become the question around what's value. Now, we obviously are not going to be able to resolve that in today's session. Each and every organization defines value somewhat differently. Sometimes people expect value to be greater than what they've paid for or what they have expected to receive. Other organizations, their expectations are defined, and that expectation is what they basically deem as value. So I don't want to get into a hair-splitting discussion around semantics here, but I just want to make sure that you understand that while you may define value and value for money one way, it doesn't necessarily mean others define value for money in the same fashion. With that prefatory comment in place, let's get into topic number one, and that is, how can we build those additional levels that are needed for trust? We talk about working and collaborating with our suppliers externally, but there has to also be a certain element, a certain treatment and focus around building trust internally. Because if we don't have trust within our internal stakeholder community, then our pursuits externally are going to be somewhat a waste of effort. So we want to make sure that the trust that we create as the practitioner, that trust flows within our organization as well as external to our relationships with our suppliers. I've alluded to this point a few minutes ago, but I just want to emphasize this. The first level of pursuit that we have to go after is going to be around trust. Once we can create a greater level of trust, we can then build upon that foundation and collaborate. The next level up is the one that we're going to focus on today, and that is around innovation. We cannot just mission ourselves to go and innovate with our suppliers or to build a mechanism with our stakeholders that we're going to go and engage our contractors in an innovative pursuit. We have to build that trust, then that will lead to collaboration, and from that collaboration we will get to innovation. So if you do not have a culture, a foundation of trust or of collaboration, I would encourage you, before you go on the mission and the purpose of generating innovation, that you focus first on these two initial levels and make sure that you have those in place before you go off to that loftier pursuit. Because once we get onto the path of innovation, it represents a significant investment of resources. And unless we have assurance that we are on a solid foundation around trust and collaboration, neither party would really be justified investing their resources into creating and capturing, into generating greater innovation. I am not here to try to convince you that innovation is quick and easy, that it comes with low investment. It takes a significant investment. It takes time. It takes additional patience. But once you're able to create that innovation, you will find that your relationships with your suppliers yield significantly greater value for money. And so some people may say that pursuit of innovation isn't worth the journey. The view is not worth the climb, that they are perfectly content in dealing with that collaboration and with that trust levels. Yes, you can create greater levels of value for money by building up trust. You can get up to even higher levels of value for money by building collaboration. Our argument today, our presentation to you today, the thoughts and concepts we're trying to lay out is to get you to that ultimate destination, that highest plateau, because that's where you're going to get the highest levels of return on the investment, but the investment will be there. And I don't want to mislead you into thinking, again, that this investment is going to come quick and easy. And so let's talk first around that basic level of trust. We find in certain organizations that the culture of trust does not exist, that the mechanisms, the policies, the procedures in place do not encourage trust, that there is a lack, a void around the enablers of trust. Based on the research that we've done, not only with our clients in those relationships we have with them, but also external research in the public domain, we've come to identify a few key enablers that help build trust to the higher levels needed to then springboard into the collaboration mode. The essentials that are needed for trust is, first off, transparency. Transparency is becoming significantly important in so much of what we do when we want to get out to that innovation plateau. Collaboration. Without the transparency, the trust will be basically minimal. We want to make sure that there's a certain level of reciprocity in our relationship with our suppliers as well as with our internal stakeholders. So unless we're open and transparent, unless we have reciprocity with our internal stakeholders and our external suppliers, the trust levels are going to stay to a minimum. We want to also demonstrate that there's a certain amount of equality, of equity, of investment that's going to bring benefit to the parties. I want to trust you, you want to trust me. We tell each other that, we're transparent with each other. We say we want to be equally and mutually reciprocal, but unless we can demonstrate that we're going to invest something into that pursuit, and we're going to do it in an equal level of effort, that trust will not take root. We want to make sure that the communications are open, and this somewhat reinforces the transparency aspect, but many times the communication is done in a more haphazard fashion. And so I would encourage you, communication is key, but having your communication strategy, your tactics, your defined approach around communication becomes important if we're trying to build that trust level. I would encourage you to also ask yourself around your culture, whether there is a compatibility of culture, a compatibility of transparency, reciprocity, equality, and communication. Making sure that while both of us want to help build higher levels of trust within our relationship and within our respective organizations, that there needs to be done somewhat of an evaluation around that compatibility, building that upon that culture, but building upon the other mechanisms as well. And we've covered in prior sessions around the importance of empathy. Empathy is much more impactful than many have been giving credit to it. A lot of the recent research around empathy is underscoring what a core, key, essential element, enabler empathy is as we move forward and as we try to build trust. And so I would suggest to you that if you have low levels of transparency in your organization, if in your relationship as well, if you have very little reciprocity, there is very little equality, we're not communicating, we just know we're not compatible, that our cultures do not mesh, they're not compatible, and we don't really have a trusting culture, and we have very little empathy, you really should just sort of stop right there and not pursue the innovation pursuit. Without these enablers, you're going to be held back. You can put a lot of time and effort into the pursuit of collaboration as well as innovation, but it is not going to allow you. These lack of enablers is going to prevent you from getting to your ultimate destination. So as an example, I want to use one, it's well, not Australia, it's our friends in Canada up in Vancouver Island Health. The Vancouver Island Health Authority is a public sector health entity up in British Columbia. They had over a number of years a relationship with South Island Hospice, and these basically, the hospitalists were the providers of services into the health authority. The relationship was very strained. They were somewhat at loggerheads with each other over a number of years, but over time they came to realize they needed to find a different way of working together. that if they were going to seek and capture greater levels of collaboration and the highest level of innovation, that things had to change up. And so they decided to, as a first step, to build greater levels of trust between the organizations. And over a period of time, not long, but a period of time, it was 2 years, they realized by helping focus on building trust that they could create a significant turnaround that would ultimately lead to greater levels of collaboration and innovation between these two organizations. Our colleagues within Commercial Officers Group at Vested, Kate Fatasic and the team that has been very much involved in pursuing Vested as a sourcing, a relationship, a contracting model and methodology, got very much involved with Canada's Vancouver Health Authority and the South Island Hospitalists in helping foster greater trust levels. They did assessments on this journey to bring their focus upward. And at the beginning, they did take a snapshot around the words to describe how the parties felt about each other. At the beginning of the journey, 84.5% of the adjectives that were being used to describe the other party were somewhat negative. Within 2 years, the drastic turnaround was just noticeable. It was just stuck out. For 86.2% positive adjectives. So when you see you and your commercial partner, be it a contractor, a supplier, or a provider of services such as South Island Hospitalists, if you can demonstrate that you are moving in a direction where the perspective, the perceptions of each other's are improving, then that should signal to you that getting up and pursuing collaboration is now is the time. The iron is hot, to strike that iron while it's hot to be able to move in that direction. But they took the time, the requisite time, to start building a positive relationship to create much more higher levels of trust in order to then enable them to get to that next level. I would suggest to you that a great resource for you to go to, and to be transparent with you, I've been doing a fair amount of work with the University of Tennessee. In fact, they've had me help out on a number of sessions as a adjunct lecturer. But within the University of Tennessee and the Vested methodology that Kate Fatasic has led on, we've created a tool around compatibility and trust. There is a 5 areas that we look at with this index that we create, that score, if you will, and we look at the focus between the parties or of the parties, at their communications, whether they're oriented towards a team pursuit, whether they're pursuing innovation, and whether they have a certain level of performance trust. Today's session is not about the tool, but I'm raising this to demonstrate that there is significant amount of effort across the globe, and the University of Tennessee tool is just one of many, but it's a great tool to look at. And it's available, much of this is available out on the internet. It's open source that Kate and her team has made available to be able to do somewhat of a test. Now, typically what we see is if there is a 70% score, that tends to be a very positive sign. And so if you are running a capability and trust assessment tool for yourself, and you see you are not yet up to that 70%, I would encourage you to hold off on pursuing the collaboration innovation, find ways of building within your organization higher levels, higher ratings, if you will, to then pursue this next level of collaboration and innovation. Once you get yourself up into that 70+ range, then you're ready to take that journey to the next level. All too often, and this is where we've seen so many opportunities basically get wasted. So often people want to collaborate, they want to go and create greater innovation, and they immediately rush out the door with their commercial partner and try to do it, and it doesn't get them anywhere. And they then quickly resolve, well, this is a waste of time. The stuff we've read about it, the stuff we've heard about, is just really not for us. And in reality, it is for them. They're just not quite ready. And so getting their house in order around having the requisite level of trust is that first step. And these 3 years is within one organization. They did a self-assessment around their capability and trust levels. And in 2016, they found that they were falling short of that targeted threshold of 70%. A couple of years later, they found some progress and where they were getting moving up further. And then they found 3 years later in 2021, in some of these areas, they made some further progress. In some areas, they somewhat moved back, went in retroactive direction, but they were able to then catch that this is waning and we need to find ways of resuscitating and keep pushing those areas out further. So having these benchmarks within your organization, these tools that can measure whether the organization is ready to pursue collaboration and innovation with the supply base is important, because we, again, do not want to make the investment without getting the return of that investment. So once you get into, and this is just a little bit more detail around the Tennessee model, around the vested, once you start getting a little bit more detail, you can start mapping out what your party and the other party styles are, and you're then able to take these analysis outputs and being able to compare your firm against some other firm and make sure that there is either alignment that would allow us to then proceed as two parties, or if there's misalignment, which would cause us to take time out between the two parties and say, before we proceed and try to create greater collaboration and innovation, we need to bring greater alignment between ourselves before we go down that path together. So having at least some of those tools that you're using is important. If you want more detail, feel free to reach out to me. You can certainly go out. Google search allows you to find University of Tennessee and those tools. You can certainly reach those yourself, but I'd be more than happy to point you in the direction that you need to go. So let me give you an example around how organizations are at times pursuing innovation and collaboration when perhaps they shouldn't be. And yet other organizations are spot on and they should be pursuing it. There's a gentleman out of Detroit, Michigan in the US named John Hankey. John has been running a study for a number of years. And in that study, he's looked at the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the Fords, the General Motors, the Hondas, the Nissans, etc. of the world, and their auto manufacturing parts suppliers, the raw materials, the parts, the components that go into manufacturing automobiles. And John goes out, he has, and since COVID, it's been much more remote and Zoom-based interactions, but John has gone out to thousands of suppliers in the automotive industry and has asked those automotive industry suppliers, across this portfolio of OEMs, who's the easiest to do business with? Who's the most difficult to do business with? Which one is the greatest candidate for collaboration and innovation? Which ones create trust with you? And which ones somewhat don't trust and don't have a culture of trust? And the studies have year after year demonstrated significant value to the participants of that study. The reason being is those that score well realize how they can then pursue collaboration and innovation to create greater value for money. Some, though, at the other end of the spectrum, who are not very trusting organizations, who do not have great levels of trust between them and their suppliers and contractors, tend to find themselves somewhat, spinning their wheels, pardon the pun, spinning their wheels, trying to find ways to get innovation and collaboration, but they continually fall short. But the studies that John and his team have basically uncovered demonstrates that in certain organizations, certain automobile manufacturers, the trust levels are high. In other automobile manufacturers, the trust levels are low. I'm going to bring you back to this study here in a little bit because we within Commercial Officers Group have done a little bit more additional research that helps augment that analysis. So make that as somewhat of a mental holder in your mind for just about 10 minutes, and I'm going to be getting back to this point here in a moment. I want to also emphasize as we talk about trust that if we do a compatibility trust assessment, we have to ask ourselves, are we really looking in terms of trust at the organization or certain specific individuals within the organization? Now, is this a systemic level of trust across your agency, across your department, across your government function, or is it a unique characteristic of a particular individual? You might be a very distrusting individual in a very trusting organization, or a very trusting individual in a very distrusting organization. And you will find your pursuits to either pursue or to avoid building up the relationship with suppliers being somewhat contrary to your organization and that direction. Not only for within your organization, but with your suppliers. You may find that the key contact that you have within your supplier or your contractor, they as an individual are extremely trustworthy. They're very trusting. However, the organization that they work for is far short of trusting or trustworthy. And so as you do your assessments, your capability, your compatibility and trust assessments, or whatever tool you use to do that preliminary assessment, I would encourage you to make sure you're always focusing on that organization, because the organization is always going to trump, is always going to override what the individual trust quotient is for a particular contact person within that organization. So I would encourage you to stay focused on organization, and in your pursuits, always emphasize the organizational trust level rather than the individual trust level. And again, many times we'll say, well, we've dealt with the same person for 10 years. They're extremely trustworthy. But if you try to build greater levels of collaboration and innovation, that individual's trust level may not be as indicative of the journey you're about to take as you're trying to deal with the broader organization who doesn't have that same profile of trust as the individual does. And so as we pursue the trust levels and we try to foster and elevate those trust levels that go to that second tier of collaboration, we have to ask ourselves, what is necessary in order to build that next level of trust? Now, some of you have listened to some of the other sessions, and I've used this example in the past, but it's certainly worth bringing in right now. I was fortunate to participate in a relationship and a contracting project with a supplier, and my client, they're a large US manufacturing type organization. They had a head of engineering, and the gentleman's name was Rolf Rusing. Wonderful guy. Rolf was just a very trustworthy, very trusting individual. And the organization that he supported, that he was working for, they were increasingly interested in building trust with suppliers. They, as an organization, went out and did strategic sourcing. They, on a certain piece of capital equipment, they were spending millions of dollars, $10 million per year on this particular type of capital equipment. They went through a strategic sourcing initiative, and they were able to downsize their supply base from 4 or 5 key suppliers to 1 strategic supplier. Now, Steve was the head of sales from the supplier organization. Steve himself personally was very high level trust, and his organization had the interest in being trustworthy and to trust Rolf's customer organization. And so the trust levels, the compatibility was at the requisite level, and they met as they move forward in this new model of operations around being a strategic supplier. And they said, we need to collaborate. Let's collaborate and find ways to reduce costs. So in the introductory kickoff meeting on that chapter in their relationship, Rolf and his team and Steve and his team got into the conference room, and Rolf had me come because he wanted me to help develop the contract to capture what was going to be done around this new collaborative pursuit. And in that meeting, Rolf looked over at Steve and said, we know we're not perfect, but we want to find out, Steve, from you and your team, what is it about our organization that just drives you crazy? What do we do that is, just not right? And that was a magic moment because Rolf invited Steve and his team to trust the customer organization without repercussion. Rolf assured Steve, whatever you tell us, we won't take it against you. We are committed to this relationship. We have down selected to you, and we've sent home your competitors, and we no longer have contracts with them. So we're in this journey together, and we can't just throw you away because you're open and transparent with us. So after about 5-10 minutes of giving those types of assurances, Steve looked at his team and they whispered something, and Steve then said, Rolf, if there's one thing that we could get you to do differently as a customer, we would ask that you eliminate the red stripe. And on that piece of capital equipment that Rolf and his team were always buying from Steve's organization, from that industry, they as a customer had a very unique requirement, very unique specification of having a piece of red stripe basically burned into the housing of this capital equipment. It wasn't a decal, it wasn't something simple to apply. It involved a lot of engineering and manufacturing time to build that little red stripe into the equipment. And Steve said to Rolf, hey, if you can stop requiring that we put that red stripe in, this $10,000 piece of equipment, we can reduce the price by 20%. So that was going to be a $2,000 piece of cost that was going to be eliminated if the red stripe was to be discontinued. Now, Rolf and his organization were buying at least 1,000 of these pieces of equipment every year. And so a $2,000 savings on 1,000 pieces of equipment was over $2 million of overall cost elimination. So Steve and Rolf were very eager that they could collaborate on this. And Rolf looked at his team and said, why is it that we have this red stripe? And the team said, we're not quite sure. Rolf said to Steve, let's get back in a week and we will revisit and we'll come up with a decision if we can eliminate the red stripe. A week later, we came into the conference room again, and Rolf announced to Steve, yes, we're going to discontinue demanding this red stripe be put onto the piece of equipment. And Steve said, oh, this is great. So happy to hear this. And then, of course, we decided we had to discuss what's the value for money. What's the additional incremental savings? And Rolf raised the point and say, now, we're going to create savings. How can we share in these savings? And this $2,000 per piece of equipment, Rolf suggested that they split it 50-50. We basically, instead of $10,000 for a piece of equipment, we're dropping $2,000 of cost off. Steve, you can charge us $9,000. So you save $1,000 on your cost, so you get $1,000 of extra profit, Steve, and we as the customer organization get to buy these pieces of equipment for $1,000 less. Steve said, no, Rolf, we're not up for sharing in the savings, to which Rolf immediately thought that he wasn't going to get a lower price on the equipment. But what Steve was in fact saying was they wanted to give all of the savings to Rolf and his team and to his organization. And so Steve was saying, no, we're going to lower our price to $8,000. Rolf's like, no, you need to capture and share in these savings, charge us $9,000. And so there became this quick little negotiation where the customer was asking, charge us $9,000, and the supplier was demanding, no, we insist on only charging you $8,000, which was a discussion that was extremely unusual and not, commonly heard. And so I would encourage you, as you have that trust level and you can start to collaborate and be a little bit more open and pursue some joint opportunities for value capture, look for those red stripes that you and your supplier can somewhat pursue together. Now, that isn't necessarily innovation, it's just open communication, and we're going to collaborate and coordinate amongst ourselves to try to build a more cost-efficient piece of equipment. Now, if Rolf and Steve said, what additional features and functionality and new improved elements can we build into this piece of equipment, then that would be innovation. But the collaboration generally has to occur first and perhaps be in place for a year or two before Rolf and Steve come back to the conference room and say, now that we've been saving a lot of money and you've been getting greater profits on these pieces of equipment, let's find ways to reinvest those savings to make the piece of equipment even better. They, Rolf and Steve and their teams, did in fact come back a year or two later to look at how to not only, yes, continue saving money on the equipment, but build additional features and functionality that would benefit the respective organizations. And so I would encourage you that as you collaborate, always keep an eye on that higher plateau. We're not here to say that every time you collaborate, it's going to lead to that next level of innovation and being able to create greater value for money. At least the journey, you might only take it halfway up the ladder, but at least it's a journey worth pursuing. In another instance, this one comes out of the oil and gas sector. My client that I dealt with, her name is Rosemary. Rosemary was the head of a certain operation area within the customer organization. And this was many, many years ago. I'd say close to 25 to 30 years ago. And offshore drilling platforms are somewhat islands in the ocean that are man-made in order to drill for oil and gas under the surface of the water, down under the surface of the earth. And so it becomes a very costly pursuit to find those hydrocarbons. And the organizations that have these offshore drilling platforms have difficulty, or had at that time difficulty, in communicating with those offshore drilling platforms. Yes, they had satellite dishes that could transmit data, but the overall communication was somewhat problematic. Rosemary and her team at the customer organization started working with IBM to create a messaging system that would allow, yes, the individuals on the drilling platforms to somewhat send out outgoing data in messages, but also to be able to receive messages from land-based research departments, operations facilities based in Texas or around the Gulf of Mexico. And so this communication of written words going back and forth through the airwaves was the precursor for email. At that point, it was called like Professional Office System, or the acronym was PROFS, P-R-O-F-S. And PROFS was a collaborative, innovative pursuit between one customer and IBM to build a messaging system that would allow them, yes, they were collaborating on how to move data back and forth between an offshore drilling platform and land-based office buildings, but they took it up to the next level and created innovation. They were collaborating, but they saw the benefit if they pursued it further. And so the value for money that Rosemary and her organization were able to generate were by being able to communicate with their offshore drilling platforms in written email precursor to what we currently see as email type of messaging systems that gave her company a competitive advantage over others out in the Gulf of Mexico who were drilling and who did not have that communication capability with their colleagues who are based in Houston or wherever else. And so we see a number of instances where the supplier is already in a collaborative way with their customer, and those two parties say, it's great we're transmitting data and you're helping and collaborating with us, IBM, but we want to find a new approach. Can you work with us? Now, one of the benefits that Rosemary and her organization had was they received basically that email technology and software for free for a number of years because they invested into helping IBM develop it. And obviously, you know, the curse and the scourge of email that we all have to face these days, we probably would, you know, make it more of a curse than a blessing. But in the day, at its original inception, Rosemary and her team saw it as a huge opportunity to create greater value for money. And I think many of us say we're lucky and we're, you know, pleased that they in fact were able to find the technology and create it in that way. And so we need to always identify that these new technologies that we have in place that we're going to pursue are going to be of value for money, but value to our overall efficiency and effectiveness of our organization. And so we have to look for ways to invest in our capabilities and our competencies. And as a matter of semantics, capability for us within Commercial Officers Group is process, it's structure, it's culture, whereas competency is the skills, it's the individual people and their ability as practitioners to be able to deliver greater. We've run this slide in a number of our sessions, and for those of you who haven't seen it yet, we basically have identified that the yield off of our contracts, of our commercial practices, at times falls short of 100% yield. In fact, most of us, the best we can ever hope for is around 96 to 98%. There's always going to be some inefficiency and some challenges. But the majority of contracts and commercial relationships is going to be around the 92 to 90% range, meaning that we've got around 8 to 10% additional value that we can be capturing. And for us to capture that additional 10% value, we need to, yes, improve our capability around collaboration and innovation, creating processes, approaches, cultures that enable that capability of collaboration and innovation. But we also need to build and develop our skills around innovation management. Increasingly, what we're seeing is a separate skill set that is being basically formed around innovation management. It is somewhat nascent as a defined skill set. Perhaps it's not as defined as negotiations or quality and Six Sigma or various other change management and drafting skills. But innovation management increasingly is being cited as a key skill within the supply chain management, the procurement, strategic sourcing disciplines, contract management disciplines. And so I would encourage you, if you are not assessing your skill set within your organization around that innovation management skill, that you look at what it means to your organization and find ways to building out that skill set. Because without innovation management, if you are trying to get to that upper right corner of that, what I'll call rainbow diagram, you are going to somewhat hit a ceiling at around 4.5, 4.6, and you'll never really get to that absolute total success rate that you hopefully are able to pursue and interested in chasing with your commercial partners. Okay. Let's see, I'm just seeing a few people messages. None of them are really questions, they're just more comments. So let me get into the final topic here around measuring the benefits, identifying the benefits and making them measurable. Keep in mind with the benefits and the measurements, there is a fair amount of subjectivity that does come into play. And I would encourage you to recognize that. It doesn't mean that you cannot use it as a measure or somewhat of a benefit portfolio. Subjectivity shouldn't ruin it for you. There are some objective pursuits around measuring value for money, defining what that additional value for money is. But there are other benefits that are somewhat subjective in nature. For instance, for the customer, first to use Rosemary with the advent of email, an offshore drilling platform. By being the first to use that, she and her organization were getting a competitive advantage over others in the oil and gas sector. Another benefit to us, the customer, is we get to input into what to design, making sure that it's fit for our purposes. So being able to help architect and design what that ultimate innovation is going to be allows us to make sure it is closely aligned and congruent with our needs and wants. There is the measurable the element around value for money that we can actually put some dollars and cents measures to, additional savings, cost savings, speed, velocity, efficiency, things of that nature are how many are generating value for money measures around the innovation and collaboration pursuits. But we have to make sure that the supplier or contractor sees benefit, because if we're the only ones who sees the benefit, then the contractor and supplier doesn't see the equality or equity. That's that key enabler around trust. And because they're not seeing that element, they're not seeing the trust levels, and it's stopping us at that plateau, at that basement around trust. We want to make sure that we're hearing the voice of the customer as a supplier, that we are hearing it directly and first, because as a supplier, it basically is the parallel around first use. We're the first to be able to tap into that want or need or expectation of the customer, and it gives us as a supplier that competitive advantage. It generates for us as a supplier long-term revenue. And I say this somewhat half kidding, it also gives us some free labor. The customers helping us develop some of the innovations that we would otherwise as a supplier be developing on our own, using exclusively our own labor and our own resource. Well, that labor is not really free. Basically, though, it many times gets labeled as such. But the benefit to the supplier is going to be something then that creates a relationship improvement that sees the customer as being that customer of choice. And that customer then sees the supplier being the supplier of choice. And so that reciprocity that helps build and strengthen the relationship, that opens up trust levels further so that we can collaborate, and the collaboration levels further so that we can then innovate. And so the benefits become somewhat of a snowball effect, and they build upon each other. Many of you within Australia in the public sector have probably been made aware of some of the great stuff that's happening within the Australian Navy. Now, this particular project, the FFG pursuit that was at Garden Island and Sydney Harbor a few years ago, we've given a fair amount of visibility to that project. But a lot of the benefit, the success of that project came from building higher levels of trust, leading to greater collaboration, which then led to innovation. And those innovations, the collaboration as well, but the innovations helped allow the Navy to get routine maintenance, scheduled maintenance on the FFG category of ships that were being sent into the Garden Island Naval Base. That maintenance was being done under budget, ahead of schedule, and the full fulfillment and performance of the punch list of items to be done around the maintenance. Prior to them taking a different approach of building trust and fostering innovation and collaboration, things were repeatedly over budget, delayed, and short of full performance. And so I would encourage you to give thought to what you can do in order to build greater levels of innovation. Now, this is the automotive discussion revisited, the follow-up. Within John Henke's study, there are 6 major automobile manufacturers. And what we saw in our research with suppliers in the automotive industry was that we asked them, what about this particular OEM? Are they easy to do business with? Is there a certain level of compatibility and trust between you and that organization? Are you seeing levels of innovation? The research that we've done and the results we've got back is if it's relatively low versus the other end of the spectrum, low levels of ease of business and trust and compatibility, the innovation levels tend to be very low. If it's high levels of ease of doing business and high levels of trust and compatibility, the levels of innovation tend to be higher. And so if you're looking for areas to specifically hone in on as a customer, ask yourself, do we make it easy to do business with us? And do we create a level of trust and compatibility that aligns with the suppliers and contractors? I am going to close here in just a minute. I just want to emphasize that as you go through these efforts, as mentioned earlier, make sure you build process. Don't just do it a one-off. Try to strive to create a innovation program that has a process, that there's governance, that it follows somewhat of a scientific method, that you're bringing documentation in, and that you can find better ways of doing that. Keep in mind, Edison, when asked, how it felt to invent the light bulb, he said, well, not only did I invent the light bulb, but I found 2,000 ways not to create a light bulb. And so that really underscores that every time you try to innovate, collaborate with your suppliers, it doesn't mean you're always going to be able to find success. But in the 2000, and I'm not saying you'll have 2,000 failures, but in the 2,000 ways that you find not to innovate and collaborate with your suppliers, document what not to do so that you don't keep repeating those false steps. Create somewhat of an overall longer-term approach and process, and create somewhat of that repeatable scientific method that we use in a science laboratory. Keep documenting and taking on that same type of an approach as we do in a laboratory. Before we wrap up, one last point that I want to emphasize is collaboration and innovation are typically going to be very much in the supplier relationship management post-award. Now, this drawing comes from the UK, out of the public sector. Crown Commercial Services helped generate this initially. We within Commercial Officers Group find it to be really spot on. Current state for many organizations and over the process, using that clock dial analogy of 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock as you move through the process. Relatively low involvement from procurement at the front end strategy side. Once we get into the tendering and negotiation, heavy involvement, but once we sign the contract, we tend to, as procurement, be less involved in the relationship management phase. If we can flip this bell curve, flip it upside down, where we're heavily involved in strategy, little involvement in the transactional aspect, but elevate our role when we get into the SRM, that is where we can then build and pursue opportunities for the collaboration, the innovation with those suppliers. But if you are bogged down using this the red curve here, bogged down and all your time is being consumed in creating tenders, sourcing, going out to market, getting evaluations of bids and proposals and negotiating, you'll have very little time left on your plate to look at ways to innovate and collaborate And so one of the keys to success, best practice, leading practice, is free some of this, automate it, somewhat streamline those processes, somewhat allow the end users to self-service island on some of their activities to free up your bandwidth so you can focus in this part of the diagram where the innovation collaboration really is where that occurs. So we encourage you to keep in mind a new agenda does exist. We do suggest you're going to need to focus on some new skills or start using some of the skills that you've used to a lesser extent. Define what your new deliverables are and go and get that value for money created. That is it for today. We did cover these 5 points. If you want to go back to revisit any of those, reach out to me directly. By all means do. You can come to our website or reach me directly at jbergman@commercialofficers.com. Hopefully this was of value to you today, and I encourage you to give thought to how you yourself personally can create that next level of success in pursuing value for money. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.